faithfully delivering value, interpreting great books worldwide. Hello, this is Sally Talking Books. Today, I'm introducing this book, a famous work by American anthropologist James Scott titled Seeing Like a State. This book has a subtitle, How Certain Schemes to Improve the Human Condition Have Failed. The subtitle is long, but in plain terms, it's about how the state with good intentions ends up causing harm. In modern society, the state's influence is everywhere. It shapes our familiar modern life, from managing personal identity info to extensive high speed public transport. You see the state's shadow all around. But the state's path to modernization isn't always positive. In fact, it can trigger major disasters. History isn't short of such examples. Some state led social engineering projects aim to improve people's living conditions, but they cause environmental damage. Plus, water and food shortages lead to large scale casualties, ultimately backfiring. Facing these failed social projects, many states reflect, but blaming just policy errors or execution flaws doesn't explain why lessons aren't learned to prevent tragedies. Is there a deeper ideological root behind these extreme events? The book Seeing Like a State provides answers to this. The book's content can be viewed from three aspects. First, what is the state's perspective? Second, what impacts has this state perspective caused? Third, is it possible to avoid the disasters brought by the state perspective? First, let's explore what kind of perspective it is. Through the state's eyes, what different scenes emerge when viewing society and the world? Almost at the book's start, Scott points out that the state sees the world not as colorful and diverse as we do, but lacking individuality. For instance, your colleagues, bunkmates, or neighbors, each has a unique story, never repeating. But to the state, it's a highly simplified view, like a map index, where you're just a number in a census table. Scott argues that the state apparatus's core issue is legibility and simplification, reducing complex social phenomena to manageable administrative items. Only in this way can the state effectively manipulate the managed subjects to achieve taxation. So, functions and goals like conscription, economic development, and national security protection. Let's examine a classic case, the development of scientific forestry in Prussia. Speaking of forestry, from an individual's perspective, you might see serene forests, crisp bird songs, and such. But from the state's perspective, these things become invisible. In the state's eyes, forestry's sole purpose is fiscal revenue. With Prussia's 18th century capitalist development, timber consumption surged dramatically. To effectively secure and boost forestry revenue and ensure stable timber output with uniform specs and consistent quality. Starting in 1765, Prussia developed scientific forestry, transforming chaotic mountain woodlands into single species plantations, planting in strictly spaced rows while uniformly tracking fertilization, rainfall, weeds, etc. This way, even inexperienced workers could manage tasks by following the data sheets. Eventually, many German forests contained only fast-growing commercial species like spruce and pine. Native forests became monoculture machines, yielding timber volumes several times higher than natural growth. Similarly, this perspective shaped urban transformations. City layouts reveal the state's drive for clarity and simplification. In medieval European cities like 16th century Bruges, layouts were highly irregular. Even today, tourists experience winding alleys, scattered gardens, and asymmetrical plazas in these ancient cities. Simply put, city layouts weren't orderly. But by the 19th century, Chicago, Philadelphia, New York, and Washington featured orderly grid patterns. Main streets became numbered avenues and blocks. Slums and wealthy districts were clearly segregated. Malls, parks, and roads all arranged by numerals. Clearly, medieval European layouts felt more organic, reflecting locals' daily rhythms. Whereas modern metropolises were meticulously pre-planned, layouts instantly legible, easing municipal management, transport, and global trade. This represents the state's clear management of urban layouts in the modernization process. However, Scott argues that simplification and legibility are merely prerequisites, making large-scale social engineering possible, an inevitable path for any modern state administration. Only when these administrative techniques evolve to a near superstitious level, giving rise to extreme modernist centralization, does it lead to reckless disregard for reality, pushing impractical mega projects towards inevitable failure. All right, now let's move on to the second point. What impacts does the state's perspective actually bring? Keir Scott focuses on analyzing extreme modernism. What is extreme modernism? Simply put, it's a strong belief, almost superstitious, in scientific and technological progress applied to all state affairs. This ideology has a linear historical view. The past is entirely ignorant and backward, while the future is inevitably bright and advanced. To hasten the arrival of the future, it's necessary to quickly shed traditional customs and historical burdens. A whole nation develops technological plans, racing the economy towards modernization. For this, let's look at, two typical examples: the planning of Brasilia and the villagization in Tanzania. These two large-scale social engineering projects occurred in South America and Africa, covering both urban and rural areas, demonstrating that extreme modernism's influence is everywhere. The first example is Brasilia, dubbed by Scott as the city closest to extreme modernism. In 1956, Brazil's new president, Kubitschek, took office. To balance the developed coastal areas with the backward inland regions, aiming for Brazil to achieve 50 years of progress in 5, the new government decided to move from the old capital, Rio de Janeiro, to the newly built capital, Brasilia. Brasilia's chief architect, Costa, was deeply influenced by Soviet architectural modernism, emphasizing grand, rational, and scientific building designs. Under his planning, a brand new city rose from the desolate plateau. Viewed from above, it resembled a large triangle. In the center are government buildings, museums, and squares. On the wings are residences. Every 360 houses form a residential block, and every 4 blocks have a school and a cinema. After all, residents in the new capital had fixed zones assigned for everything, from daily needs to work, entertainment, transportation, and administration, even achieving 25 square meters of green space per person, exceeding UN standards. On the surface, Brasilia did symbolize Brazil entering a brand new era of modernization. Gone were the old capital's shady corners housing gangs and brothels, along with traffic pollution, noise, and subpar public facilities. Yet Brasilia bred new, graver problems, as Brasilia's first-generation immigrants called it, Brasilitas, meaning the city's bureaucratic rigidity. Life here was painfully dull. You were either at home, at work, or commuting between them. They declared Brasilia's streets dead. No vibrant community life, just traffic corridors, coffee shops, stores, vendors vanished, sucking vitality from the city. Thus, Brasilia became known as a technocrat's bureaucratic fantasy, not a city for living citizens. Extreme modernism's damage wasn't just stolen joy, it caused economic ruin too. For instance, Tanzania's 1973 to 1976 Ujamaa village movement experiment. This campaign forcibly settled most Tanzanian farmers, rushing rural areas into urbanization. Previously, Tanzania's 12 million people had 11 million scattered nationwide, mostly small farmers and artisans. This could never develop industrialized agriculture like America's. So President Nyerere decreed, relocate 9 million people into settlements. Next, concentrate labor and land for large-scale farming. This historic Ujamaa village movement was Africa's biggest forced resettlement. President Nyeri was then an international celebrity. As an African leader from an underdeveloped nation, his vision for communal agriculture earned global admiration. Many rushed to copy his Tanzanian dream. Well, it's pretty straightforward and clear. First, concentrate settlements to make it easier for the government to provide education, healthcare, and water to farmers, improving their lives. Secondly, concentrated settlements free up more land, and pooling human resources allows for more efficient development of collective agriculture. The Ujamaa villages clearly embody the style of extreme modernism. Here, almost every household lines up along main roads in straight lines. To planners, this means convenient travel and easy transportation. Then, the surrounding vacant land is divided into blocks, with each block mandated to grow a single crop as decided by the government. Before this, Tanzanian farmers typically intercropped coffee, bananas, soybeans, and other crops. Since harvest times differ, intercropping extends the harvesting period. But after concentrated settlements, officials came and said, "This won't do. We need to develop modern agriculture, which requires large-scale monoculture." So coffee growers only plant coffee and banana growers only plant bananas. This also makes it easier for agricultural technicians to inspect and supervise the designated planting blocks. As we often say, ideals are plump, but reality is bony. So, how did this epic Ujamaa village movement turn out? The outcome was disastrous. Tanzania's uniform planning, settlements, and monoculture blocks ignored local farmers' long-standing agricultural knowledge, favoring government plans dubbed modern agriculture. While living by roads made travel easier, farming fields became farther away, and single crop planting led to frequent pests and diseases. When crops got sick, pesticides were applied, ultimately causing incomes to plummet. As a result, from 1973 to 1975, Tanzania spent over 1.2 billion shillings importing food, equivalent to the cost of a cow per household, a staggering loss. The only ones who didn't suffer losses in this whole process were probably the salaried workers, agricultural officials. During implementation, agricultural officials competed fiercely, vying for achievements in data like relocated populations, moved villages, and land area, without considering whether it violated the inherent laws of productivity development. Fortunately, Tanzania later learned its lesson, applied the brakes in time, and ultimately avoided economic collapse and large-scale famine. Having discussed the Brasilia and Tanzania cases, you must now have a deeper understanding of extreme modernism and its negative impacts. When states become superstitious about extreme modernism and constantly attempt to reshape nature, society, and people's daily lives, negative consequences and even disasters inevitably follow. So people might ask, what lessons can humanity learn from this? Beyond reflection, where does hope lie? Is there a way out for modern people? This is what the third part aims to answer. First, Scott argues we must learn lessons, respect reality, avoid oversimplification, don't idolize utopias, and never exclude concrete knowledge and experience from planning. In Sartre's words, ideas cannot cover reality. Therefore, states and elites must implement policies with sufficient humility and caution. Moreover, this respect isn't just a simple attitude. It has a concrete object, a system completely different from the state's perspective. So, if the state's view relies on map-like abstraction and expert knowledge, social life depends on daily experience, habits, and common sense. The author Scott specifically proposes a term for this localized practical knowledge. The term is metis, from Greek mythology, Zeus's first wife, renowned for her resourcefulness. Scott deliberately imported this term into anthropology to show that discarding dogma and flexibly handling complexity is human wisdom. In daily life, people don't rigidly follow plans like searching for a steed with its picture. Because reality is complex and ever changing, everyone needs flexible adaptation. For example, when growing flowers, you don't blindly follow manuals, but observe weather, soil, daily temperatures, and wilting before watering. Similarly, while ports have map coordinates, actual navigation requires local pilots familiar with hydrology. Using years of practical experience, these pilots master local tides, winds, and reefs to ensure safe docking. Anyway, the author calls all these diverse, flexible practices metis. The cases of Brasilia and Tanzania we discussed earlier are the bitter fruits of ignoring metis while blindly imposing modern rationality and state will. So, what happens when Matisse is properly protected? The author specifically cites an example from 20th century West African agriculture. Back then, Western agronomy reached West Africa. Europe represented modernity, so industrialized farming was seen as absolute truth, perhaps the key to transforming Africa's backwardness. Naturally, people wanted to promote Europe's successful monoculture and centralized management. However, 80% of West African farmland used mixed cropping with multiple harvests. Changing this would have been massive. And fortunately, thoughtful agricultural scholars went there to research and discovered the brilliance of West Africa's polyculture methods. Turns out, West African soil has low fertility. Early harvested crops leave natural fertilizer for later ones. Plus, mixed cropping diversifies species, preventing large-scale pest outbreaks while conserving soil and water. Farming there depends on nature. Like investing, you shouldn't put all eggs in one basket, right? Under this West African model, one crop failing doesn't immediately cause famine. So polyculture and crop rotation actually minimize risks, making it optimal. This is West African agriculture's métis. Its logic and considerations are no less sophisticated than Europe's modern agriculture. However, the author doesn't blindly favor local knowledge while dismissing modern political and administrative techniques. He compares their dynamics to trace extreme modernism's origins and evolution. So back to our initial question, why did those projects aiming to improve the human condition fail? Scott offers his answer. In early modernity, administrative rational principles emerged, managing nature and society through simplification and legibility. This is the state's perspective. But with technological explosions and enhanced state capabilities, by the early 20th century, this perspective became extreme modernist ideology. States deeply intervened in social life, reshaping lifestyles by their will. In this situation, local practical knowledge is no longer respected. Some large-scale social engineering projects went against local practices, ultimately leading to a series of disasters in 20th century human society. Based on this, Scott opposes the abuse of state power to forcibly shape society, advocating for respect of society's own growth mechanisms and opposing the misuse of uniform rational guidance. He advocates for respecting local customs and practical knowledge. He personally leans toward anarchism, but in his view, anarchism isn't about no government, but about no extreme modernist government. He believes human society certainly needs order, but it doesn't have to be uniform. Instead, it should be diverse, unified, and rich in meaning. Suppressing these local common senses and adopting extreme modernism can instead bring chaos, destruction, and even irreparable disasters. With that said, this book has elevated from analyzing phenomena to a philosophical level. Finally, I'll add a bit more to help you better understand this book, Seeing Like a State. This book is a summary of Scott's over 10 years of research. As a scholar, long focused on the interaction between politics and society, he also wrote Weapons of the Weak and The Moral Economy of the Peasant, which study Southeast Asian peasants. These peasants, facing state policies, elite discourses, and administrative controls, flexibly respond with their Medes, developing their own social lives in the cracks. Scott even derived anthropological significance from the Liangshan heroes in ancient China's water margin. The significance is that peasants and prisoners, excluded by the state system and social rules, were forced to society's margins, yet built cultural settlements in wastelands, thus reconciling the interaction between state and society and the different knowledge systems of elites and the masses is an eternal topic. All right, that concludes the introduction to Seeing Like a State. Listen notes are below the audio. See you tomorrow.